Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Kempinen with the Mirowitz Center. And the Mirowitz Center always brings fantastic programming to the community, but I am beyond excited that we have Steve Linde here all the way from Israel. So we thank you for being here. But we also have Ellen Futterman, who is going to do the introduction today. She is the editor-in-chief of the St. Louis Jewish Light. I'm going to tell a little bit about Ellen. Her journalism career includes stints in Los Angeles, Belleville, Illinois, and St. Louis, where she worked for 25 years for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And in 2009, she joined the St. Louis Jewish Light as its editor, and she is still there today. We love everything she does with the newspaper, and we wanted her to be here today to introduce a fellow journalist. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Ellen.
Thank you so much, Susan, and good morning to everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Steve Linde. He is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, and I'm sure he's going to tell you a little bit about that. He served as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post for 5 years, from July 2011, after working as managing editor, news editor, and night editor. He started at the newspaper in 1997. He previously worked as a radio broadcaster at Israel Radio's English News. Born in Zimbabwe, Steve grew up in Durban, South Africa, and has graduate degrees in sociology and journalism, the latter from the University of California at Berkeley. Steve made Aliyah in 1987, served in the IDF, Artillery Corps, and lives in Jerusalem. So without further ado, I turn this over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all from Missouri and to Jerusalem. I'm sitting in my office here in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. I think I'll just start by giving a few words of introduction. Is that good with you? Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and hope that
yes.
you can all hear me. So as you all know, this is the fifth election we're having in Israel in less than 4 years. In fact, the new cover of the Jerusalem Report, which just came out today, says just that. And you can access the story on the jpost.com or Jerusalem Report website. But in the latest polls, the two camps, the right-wing camp led by Benjamin Netanyahu and the left-wing camp led by Prime Minister Yair Lapid, are really running neck and neck again, and it's too close to call. The latest poll on Channel 13 published last night gave Lapid's Yesh Atid faction a high of 27 seats, which is the highest it's ever received in any poll, compared to the Likud's 31 seats. And you'll remember that the Knesset, Israel's parliament, has 120 seats. So either side needs a majority of 61 to form a government. So both sides are struggling at the moment. According to the Channel 13 poll published last night, Netanyahu's right-wing bloc has 60 seats at the moment, with the religious Zionist party of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir gaining. And the left-wing bloc really depends a lot also on the Arab faction, which joined the last coalition, Ram, headed by Mansour Abbas, which is also about 4 seats, which is just above the election threshold. And the other Arab party, Hadash Tal, is also teetering above the threshold with also just 4 seats. And then elsewhere in that bloc, opposing Netanyahu is Defense Minister Benny Gantz's National Unity Party, which is a coalition between Gantz's Blue and White Party and Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party, and that's running at about 11 seats compared to the Religious Zionist Party on the other bloc's 14 seats. So together, we're seeing a very, very even race. And really, in Israel, anything can happen. I read a story that was published in the Washington Post that said Netanyahu is poised to become prime minister, which was shared with me by Ellen. and Laura. And it reminded me of a headline that I once wrote as night editor at the Jerusalem Post, that Peres is poised to become president. That was in 2000. And the next day we all woke up, saw the headline, and unfortunately it was wrong. The Knesset voted Moshe Katsav to be president, and that presidency continued for another 7 years before Peres actually did become president. So I've become very wary as a journalist to say poise in a headline when you don't really know what can happen, and really in Israel anything can happen. So it's a very interesting election. A lot depends on the voter turnout. Israelis in general have a high voter turnout of something like 70%, but who knows? I know a lot of people who are not going to vote in this election. Maybe they'll change their mind, but there's certain election apathy that's sort of set in, and this election has failed to really galvanize the public, and one can only hope that people actually will go out to vote no matter who they vote for. It's a very important election, maybe the most important election we've had, certainly in the last 5 years. And again, the outcome could really depend on how many people actually go to vote, including among the Arab sector, which could be key in the opposition to Netanyahu. Again, things are so balanced at the moment that it could go either way, and we could even go into a sixth election if there's another deadlock. So that's sort of in general where we're standing at the moment. I mean, the election is on November the 1st, which is just a few days away, and still I think it's too close to call. Again, Netanyahu's party is leading, but Lapid's party is coming very close on its heels. And, if one side could get 61 in the 120 seat Knesset, then they will be asked by President Herzog, who's currently visiting the United States for a meeting with President Biden and other meetings he has scheduled. President Herzog will give it to the party and the leader who win the most seats. And if Netanyahu wins the most seats as expected, he will be given the first shot at forming the government, just as he was in the first 3 elections. And he has reigned for longer than any other prime minister in Israeli history, more than 12 years. But Lapid and Bennett, his partner in crime in the last outgoing government, did pull it off and formed a government that's lasted, more than a year. Whether it was successful, it depends on who you talk to. They certainly did accomplish something, and that is they brought an Arab party into the Israeli coalition for the first time in history. But whether all parties now, or at least all Jewish parties, are saying they will not do that again. So it remains to be seen whether this government can pull it off again. I simply doubt it, but you never know. And one of the outside chances is Benny Gantz's party. Benny Gantz, has a lot of support among the center and right wing. And it's possible that if neither Netanyahu nor Lapid can form a government, the president could call on Benny Gantz to try and do so. And maybe then we'll just see the whole game changing, and perhaps a broad coalition of the center, right, left, and perhaps religious parties as well. So I'm going to leave it at that. Obviously, I'm happy to talk about my own personal experiences and my own personal connections with the leaders of the party. But I thought I'll just leave that as my ask your questions if you're ready to.
So if anyone has any questions, you can type it in the chat or raise your hand. I actually can start things off. I have a question. So what is the sentiment right now in Israel as far as having to vote repeatedly? Do the Israelis get tired of it and then throw up their hands and don't go back to the polls? Or are they very good about continuing to re-elect their leaders?
Well, I mean, that is a key question, and I thank you for asking it. Again, it's not clear, and the polls are very diverse about this, how many Israelis are actually going to vote this time. But you know, every election, I'm always surprised at how many people actually do go out. We're given a national holiday for Election Day, and you know, it seems to be the responsible thing to do, even if you're not sure who to vote for. So I think that again, Israelis will surprise for the better positively and go out to vote. But I don't think it'll be as high as previous elections, which have seen, you know, 70 to even 80% of the electorate going out to vote. So I have a feeling that especially among the Arab sector and the religious sector, the voting will not be as high as it was in previous elections. But again, I could be wrong, and I hope I am wrong. But you know, there's certainly been yeah, I'm not sure what the word for it is, but after voting 4 times in the last you know, three years, now the 4th year, you do get what's called shchika in Hebrew. You get a certain kind of exhaustion and tiredness about voting again. And I mean, I personally will force myself to vote because I think it's important, and I think it's, you know, a democratic right and that we should all exercise. But yeah, it's not easy to vote again and again and again and have a similar outcome. You know, Einstein said, you know, that his definition of what was it? His definition of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is insanity. And in a way, we have reached a level of insanity in Israel. And I think the consensus is that we really need to change the system. Whether we need to get a system more like in the United States, where you have a presidency, you actually vote for an individual, is one option, or we could go with the more British option, which is to directly elect a party or candidate who will represent us. But it seems to me that this system needs to be changed, and maybe that's some challenge that'll face the next government. Any other questions?
I do have a follow-up question. Do you think if Netanyahu loses this go round, that's the end for him politically?
Well, you know, a lot of people have buried Netanyahu in the past and had to eat their hats. I mean, he really is a remarkable phenomenon. He keeps coming back. He's 7, you know, and I think he just had his 72nd birthday. I might be wrong, but he's not the spring chicken, but he keeps coming back, and he certainly is, you know, the most popular leader at the moment in Israel. I mean, Lapid has done a good job and is following on his footsteps. But I think you know, Netanyahu is still the most articulate person we've ever had in the prime minister's office, and he has a huge following. This election really is about pro-Bibi or anti-Bibi. You're either for him or you're against him, and I have a feeling that this could be his comeback again. But if he loses and if he doesn't get the 60 seats, he will face increasing pressure in his own Likud party to hand the reins over to someone else. And he's always been reticent to do this. I have asked him personally, you know, who is he priming for leadership after he steps down. Some people think it's his son Yair, who's in the United States. You know, again, he hasn't actually crowned a successor ever. And at some point, I think, you know, Netanyahu will step aside, and that'll make it easier for his Likud party to join in a coalition with other parties, both on the center and the left and the religious parties, which are, you know, his natural allies. So yeah, I think everyone's waiting to see what Netanyahu will do. If he wins, he will bask in the glory of victory once again. And if he loses, I think he will, we say in Hebrew, learn the lesson, lafik et halekach, and he will step down and hand over the reins to someone else. But for now, he thinks he's the only person capable of leading Israel, and so he's not about to step down yet.
Are there any other questions that people have for Steve?
Yes. Could he please give us some insight so I have some better understanding of the religious Zionist party and what they stand for?
Yeah, the religious Zionist party, which is currently being led by Bezalel Smotrich, and famously or infamously has Itamar Ben-Gvir as his deputy, is basically a reincarnation of all kinds of other religious parties, including the National Religious Party, even though Ayelet Shaked and her Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home Party, which by the way at the moment is not making the threshold, is also a successor of the National Religious Party. But the National Religious Party in previous administrations always swung both ways. In other words, it could go left or right. And then for the last decade or so, it always went with the Likud-led or Netanyahu-led coalition. This time, the religious Zionist party is much more to the right, much more to the right of the Likud and to the right of all the other parties. Some media outlets call them Kahanists, in that they, Bezalel Smotrich himself wasn't, but Itamar Ben-Gvir was a big follower of the late Rabbi Meir Kahana, who was, as you know, assassinated, and whose party Kach was banned in Israel. But all petitions to the Supreme Court over banning the religious Zionist party have been rejected because in its current form, it does not see itself as an anti-Arab pro-Kahana Kach party. It's definitely moderated, and the leaders of the party have moderated as well. They don't anymore come out and say they don't, they won't support the rights of Arabs or gays or anyone else, but their position is quite clear that they are anti-gay and anti-Arab, and that they are very much in favor of Israel being a solely Jewish state only for the Jews, and they're pulling Netanyahu to the right. We did see this week a bit of a scandal in the media over a recording that a journalist did of Bezalel Smotrich saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is a liar, and that he, after the previous election, was ready to bring in an Arab party. But yesterday, Smotrich went on television channels to say that he basically apologized for his remarks. He wasn't talking on the record, and that he doesn't believe Netanyahu is a liar, and that he does, and as does Ben-Gvir, think that Netanyahu would be the best candidate for prime minister. So they're very much still in the Netanyahu camp, and they're vying for some very key portfolios if Netanyahu wins the election, including the public security ministry and the defense ministry even. So, it's a very interesting position. On the left, they would say a very dangerous and precarious situation in which a very right-wing party could become part of this government. The only other option would be, if Netanyahu and the Likud decided to sit with, let's say, Lapid and Yesh Atid, or Gantz's National Unity Party, rather than join in with a coalition of the far right. In the previous election, Netanyahu refused to give ministerial portfolios to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and this election he's saying that they are absolutely qualified to hold ministerial portfolios. So he's changed his tune as well, and he realizes he needs them to form the next government if he gets a 61 MK majority.
So
Any other questions?
We have two questions. So I'm going to read a question that's in the chat first, and then we'll go to Daniel. Marilyn Pitler says, the more I try and learn about the Israeli political system, the more confused I seem to get. Much like UK politics, where the prime minister needs to form the party to stay in power. Am I right? Which of the parties are more on the left? Are there any in the middle?
Yes, so thank you for the question. And yes, it is very confusing. There are actually about 40 parties standing in this election, 39 to be exact. But typically only, well, in the last election, let's see, we got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 12 parties get in. And in this election, we have absolutely right-wing parties, from the Likud to the religious parties, obviously the religious Zionist parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, Shas being the Sephardi party and the United Torah Judaism being the more Ashkenazi party, being on the right wing. And then we have Yesh Atid on the left, together with Labour and Meretz, as well as obviously the Arab parties, Hadash Tal and Ram. And then we have Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, which even though is not considered on the left, is a centrist party that joined the last left centrist coalition. And we have the National Unity Party of Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar, which considers itself also center-right, even though it supports this current coalition, which is center-left. So yes, it's very confusing, but we run the whole spectrum in Israel, from left to right, and we have quite a choice of parties to vote for. Again, I would say that the parties and their ideologies themselves are not so relevant in this election as the people who lead them. Even though you go to an election box to vote for a party in Israel and not a candidate, not a personality, a lot of people are going to vote either for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu and for someone else. So either you're going to put in a vote for the Likud because you want Netanyahu to come back to power, or you're going to put a slip for Yesh Atid, which is Yair Lapid's party, because you think he's doing a good job, or Benny Gantz, who's the third most popular leader, because you think his National Unity Party will balance between the right wing of Netanyahu and the left wing of Lapid.
Thank you, Daniel.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for the talk. I had a question. Are there any indications of rebellion in the Likud party, or do you feel like Netanyahu, who's very secure, is the leader there?
There have been signs of a rebellion, and certainly other candidates have come forth to challenge Netanyahu, including Yuli Edelstein, the former speaker of the Knesset, who is also a former refusenik. And he's very popular both in the party and in the country, but he isn't ready to really challenge him yet. He challenged him for leadership of the Likud. I think if Netanyahu, as we've said, doesn't make the majority, there are people waiting in the wings. Another person, for example, is Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, who's very popular, and others. But what's typically happened is anyone who wants to challenge Netanyahu who has left the Likud, such as Gideon Sa'ar or Ayelet Shaked, and they've challenged him from outside. I think once Netanyahu steps down, and eventually he will, then we will see all kinds of interesting people coming up in the Likud, and we will have a whole new ball game, because basically the political picture in Israel at the moment is Netanyahu, the only Bibi camp. There's only one person who can run this country, and that's Netanyahu. And unfortunately for the Likud, that they have to toe the line, or they're pushed out. Or the anti-Netanyahu camp, those people who really think that Netanyahu has had his chance to run the country, and it's time he stepped down and allowed someone else to take over the leadership mantle. Again, it's anyone's call what will happen in this election, but if Netanyahu doesn't get the majority, he certainly, I think, will be forced out by the party, and he will be forced to resign. But all polls indicate at the moment that he is going to win this election and maybe get the 61 MK majority.
Thank you, Steve.
Marilyn Pitler asked, who is leading Labor? Are there any parties that are considered major parties like our Republican and Democratic parties?
Well, Labor used to be, you remember, Israel in history used to be a big fight between Likud on one side. Menachem Begin was, the biggest Likud leader who led the so-called Mahapach in 1977, and that ended Labor's rule. And Labor on the other. Others. Am I back?
Yep, we can hear you and see you again.
You can hear me? Sorry, I somehow got a phone call in the middle of everything. So Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres and others have all been Labor. And the current president, Yitzhak Herzog, is Labor as well. But the current leader of Labor is a woman, Merav Michaeli, who's very popular in Labor. But unfortunately for Labor, most of the polls give it only 5 or 6 seats. Some even give it 4 seats, which is just above the election threshold. But Merav Michaeli has certainly taken Labor and resuscitated it in the current government. She's the transportation minister, and she's done a very good job. And I think most people see that. But Labor is certainly not a big party like the Democratic Party in the United States versus Republican. We don't have that anymore in Israel. We don't have Labor versus Likud anymore. And so what we do have is Likud followed by Yesh Atid as the next biggest party, followed by both the religious Zionist party and National Unity, one on the left and one on the right. So again, the whole ball game has changed now in Israel. We don't have 2 big parties on the left and right, even though we do have the Likud on the right and Yesh Atid on the left. It's no longer, Labor's no longer part of that game.
Steve, can you expand on what happened to the Labor Party?
Well, what happened to the Labor Party is I think it lost public support, over the years. When Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, Shimon Peres basically took over, and since then, Labor has progressively lost support, mostly from splinter parties that have broken out. You'll remember Ariel Sharon started a party that brought together Shimon Peres and others on the left together with the right, and they carried out the disengagement from the Gaza Strip. Ever since Ariel Sharon started a whole new centrist party, it's become very sexy in Israel to form centrist parties. Unfortunately, they don't seem to last. Yesh Atid was formed as a leftist alternative to the centrist party, and it seems to have done very well, but no other party since then, no other centrist party seems to last more than 1 or 2 elections. So Labor seems to have lost its support to other centrist parties, such as Yesh Atid and now National Unity led by Benny Gantz, as well as Meretz on the left, which is to the left of Labor. But again, Merav Michaeli is a very strong and well-respected leader, but she certainly doesn't have the status that previous Labor leaders had, people like Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yitzhak Herzog.
So I think Marilyn Tyson has a question. Can unmute yourself, Marilyn.
Yes. Which party has the best relationship with the United States?
Well, all parties say that we should have a strong relationship with the United States. I think it's an interesting development that President Biden chose to invite President Herzog for a meeting now, this week, just before the elections. Herzog comes from the more left-wing, labor side of the Israeli spectrum. I think that when President Biden came to Israel this year, he made it clear that he really liked Naftali Bennett, and Yair Lapid was prime minister at the time. But he also made a point of shaking Netanyahu's hand and expressing his friendship towards Netanyahu. So I think there is a bipartisan thing going on in Israel. It doesn't really matter who's in charge or which party is in office. The United States is our closest ally, and I think everyone knows that. Netanyahu challenged, Obama's presidency quite frontally when he addressed the Congress against the Iran nuclear deal. Herzog is now due to address Congress too. But I think there is a consensus in Israel, against the Iran deal, but certainly for whatever U.S. administration is in office. And I think especially now that Russia and Iran have allied in the war in Ukraine, it's become much clearer that for Israel and the United States, the good guys are on one side, and that includes the United States and Israel, and on the other side, Russia and Iran seem to have taken a course that's not only anti-Ukraine but anti-Israel as well. And so even though we have to be careful about what we say here in Israel about Russia and Putin, it seems to me that Israel is finally leaning towards supporting Ukraine in this war. So whatever administration is in office at the moment, and at the moment is the Biden administration, I think has very close ties with the current government in Israel, but that doesn't mean it won't have close ties also if Netanyahu forms the next government as well.
John Reichman would like to ask you, what is the status of the two-state solution in Israel? Does the left support it?
Well, it's a very good question, and this is not a subject that's on the agenda at all at the moment. Yair Lapid, the head of Yesh Atid, was very clear about his support for a two-state solution. And Netanyahu has been very clear about his opposition to a two-state solution. But at the moment, especially with the Palestinian Authority being led by Mahmoud Abbas, there really has been no dialogue and no engagement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, for better or for worse, during the last few years, except on security cooperation. And there is still security cooperation between the two parties. But, I don't think that the two-state solution has even been an issue in this election. It certainly hasn't made any media headlines. Israelis are much more concerned with the standard of living, with the rising costs, with all kinds of other issues, the education of their children, the relations with the diaspora. All that is much more important at the moment. And because we've had really historic agreements with the Abraham Accords, with the Gulf states and Morocco and others, the Palestinian issue has certainly been put to the side, definitely in this election.
Jen Schmitz would like to ask, how closely is Israel watching the U.S. elections, especially the possible reemergence of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think Israel is, monitoring the situation in the United States very closely. Again, from the Israeli point of view, it doesn't really matter who's president of the United States. And Donald Trump was a very pro-Israel president, no matter what you think of him. He moved the embassy from from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and did all kinds of other things that Israelis perceive as being very supportive of Israel. And so I don't think Israelis fear Donald Trump at all. And yet, you know, Joe Biden was given a very warm welcome when he came to Israel, and he's certainly seen as a very strong friend of Israel. From Israeli point of view, it really doesn't matter who's president of the United States, whether it's Biden or someone in the Republican camp. I think Israel realizes that the United States is its best friend in the world, and will do anything to maintain that friendship. And you know, from the United States point of view, Israel is its closest ally, and we in Israel know that, you know, the two countries are very close. The current ambassador to Israel from the United States, Tom Nides, is a very close friend of Israel, and is very supportive of Israel. We have an interesting interview with him coming up in the Jerusalem Report, if anyone would like to read it. And you know, I think yes, Israelis are watching the developments in the United States, but not with the same trepidation, perhaps, as you are from within the United States. And probably just as you see the election in Israel, it could go either way. You know, so we see the elections in the United States as you know, important, obviously, and relevant to Israel. But no matter what the outcome, I'm sure the close relationship between Israel and the United States will always be maintained.
Jerry Moskowitz would like to ask, is the legal situation with Bibi a factor in the election?
Well, it's a factor in that, you know, some other parties, including Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, are now saying that they will not sit under a candidate who is facing these criminal charges, you know, and so they've taken a very clear position, even though politicians often reverse their positions after the election. But they've taken a very clear stand that they won't sit under a Netanyahu government again. But, you know, Gantz said that before the 2 elections ago, and then ended up sitting in a government with Netanyahu. In fact, he was Netanyahu's defense minister. So I think if there's no other choice, they may have to swallow their words and swallow their hats, if you like, and all sit in one government together, or call another election if there's not a clear result to this election. But yes, Netanyahu's trial is ongoing. He is accused of, you know, several very serious corruption charges. And it would be a very interesting situation if he was elected again, that a sitting prime minister would have to continue going to court in Jerusalem to face these charges while being prime minister. Even though, you know, if he is prime minister, obviously he'll have a much stronger hand, and be in a much more powerful position to fight the criminal case.
I have another question for you. What effect has the political deadlock had on Israeli policy? And if you can't pass a budget, does the government shut down?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the Netanyahu government had a hard time passing a budget for 2 years, and it was left to the Lapid-Bennett government to pass the budget, which they actually did. So we do have a budget now, but it's become increasingly difficult in a Knesset that's so hung in both directions to pass a budget. And that's why it's so important that the next government has majority support. Otherwise, it won't be able to pass a budget, or it won't be able to pass any key legislation without risking being toppled. Because as you know, in Israel, because we're still a democracy, you know, every vote can end up being a vote of no confidence in the government and result even over the smallest thing, not a big thing like a budget, and can end up being the dissolution of not just the Knesset, but the government itself, which we saw recently. And that's why Bennett and Lapid decided to call new elections, because it was just impossible to pass any legislation in the Knesset. And that's why we're in the situation we are today, which is a very precarious situation. I think most Israelis are very upset that we're spending more money on another election, when that money could be going to much more important things. I can only hope that this will be the last election for a while, no matter which way it swings.
Are there any other questions? Marilyn has a question. You can unmute, Marilyn.
If your budget is in deficit, how do you fund the government? Do you borrow? Do you borrow from other countries? Do you pass bonds, or do you print money?
Well, it's a good question, although, I mean, we still have a very stable economy, and I don't want you to get the wrong impression. The Israeli economy is on the rebound after COVID, and we're doing very well, especially the high-tech sector. And yes, there is a budget in place at the moment, and even though there's a deficit in some areas, and we certainly have, a huge amount of aid coming from the United States, we're doing really well compared to other countries economically. So you shouldn't worry about us in that sense. There is a budget in place at the moment for this year, and presumably the next government will pass a budget for next year, for 2023. But yeah, all signs show that the economy in Israel is doing very well. The employment situation is improving. The inflation situation is improving, even though prices are going up and the cost of living is going up. Most Israelis seem to be happy with the situation. Yes, it's true, there are too many people living, under the poverty line. And we need to worry about that situation. But in general, the economic situation is much better than it probably is perceived to be outside of Israel. And we have, to prove it, an increased amount of aliyah from all over the world, including the United States, by organizations like, Nefesh B'Nefesh, and others are bringing immigrants now from Ukraine and Russia. We're seeing an increase in aliyah all over the place. And if you just look out the window, which I'm doing now, you see an unbelievable amount of construction, not just in Jerusalem, but all over the country. So yeah, all the factors, all the signs point to a revival in the Israeli economy, and you don't have to worry about our budget situation.
Yes. Any other questions? Well, Steve, I certainly love that that voting day is a national holiday. That it says a lot about Israel, and the fact that people they want to be a part of their government and to vote and to exercise their right as a democratic nation. So we do have about 15 more minutes. So if anybody else has any final questions.
Yeah, Steve, I got on a little late, so I apologize if you talked about this. I remember a few years ago, I heard a lot about, I'm sorry if I pronounced the name wrong. Ayelet Shaked is like an Israeli politician up and coming, but I haven't heard from her, about her in a few years in national, the media. Can you explain if she's still an up and comer or what's going on?
Well, what happened was that Ayelet Shaked partnered with Naftali Bennett in the last government, and she was, in fact, the Minister of the Interior, which is a very powerful position. And she's a very charismatic, articulate, eloquent, attractive candidate. She had a huge amount of support on the right, but then when she decided to sit in a government with Ram, the Arab party led by Mansour Abbas, she lost a lot of her credibility and spent a lot of the last couple of months apologizing for doing that. But once Naftali Bennett, who you'll remember was the first prime minister in this new government, stepped down and Yair Lapid took over, he also stepped down as head of his party, the Jewish Home Party, Beit Yehudi, and Ayelet Shaked has now essentially taken over that party. And the irony is, in a way, that although she's still very much to the right of the political spectrum, and she's the head of a mostly religious party, Beit Yehudi is predominantly religious, she herself is secular. I always found her very interesting, and I still think that one day she'll come back, but maybe not in this election. I think she's very smart. She maybe one day could return to the Likud and become even leader of the Likud, but she at the moment supports Netanyahu. She's changed her tune. And she supports a coalition, a center-right coalition under Netanyahu, and she believes that a vote for her party will get the magic 61st or 62nd or 63rd mandate in the Knesset, and that's why she's been urging everyone to vote for her party. But the latest polls put her under the threshold, which is 3.5%. They're currently giving her about 2.5% of the vote. Maybe she'll pull a rabbit out of the hat and show everyone that she can do it and get her 4 seats, and that way also allow the center-right coalition to have more than 60 seats. But at the moment, the polls show that she's struggling to make the threshold.
Thank you, because I mean, she's still very young too, right? For like a politician, yeah. So she'll have
absolutely. She's young and she has a lot of potential. Again, I just don't think she's going to see that potential realized in this election. But I could be wrong, and if she gets more than 4 seats, I'll be the first to say, "Wow, that's unbelievable."
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Steve, I think that everyone would be interested in hearing any personal stories that you have as a journalist and interviewing politicians.
Talk a little bit about each candidate. Let me start with Shaked, who, when I interviewed her at the Jerusalem Post conference, I asked her who her hero is, and she surprised me by saying Ayn Rand. And you remember who Ayn Rand is in America. The author of The Fountainhead and various other books, and the founder of, I think it was called Egotism or Egoism as a philosophy. And even though she was Jewish, she certainly fell out of favor in the United States for her. So I was interested that Ayelet Shaked thought that Ayn Rand was her hero. I've had encounters with each of the candidates. My famous encounter with Netanyahu, I'll tell you just very briefly, was when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post and I met with him in Tel Aviv. He told me, it was off the record, but unfortunately it's now on the record and in all kinds of books about Netanyahu, that he told me that, Steve, we have 2 main enemies. And I thought he was going to say Hezbollah and Hamas. And he said, Haaretz and the New York Times. They set this anti-Israel agenda, and everyone else follows them like a pack of wolves. And I repeated that, which I shouldn't have done once, but now I've repeated it more than once. And he has forgiven me for repeating it, but I do think it does tell you a little bit about Netanyahu and his fixation, if you like, his obsession with the media and which way the media swing. And then, Yair Lapid, I've interviewed him very often, and also Benny Gantz. They're both really interesting guys. Yair Lapid was a former journalist himself, a very popular columnist at Yediot Achronot. And I always found him very interesting, very thought-provoking. I like him. I'm not saying that I'll vote for him, but he's an attractive candidate. And one thing we've seen in the last few months under his premiership is that he may not be as eloquent as Netanyahu, but he certainly presents a good face of Israel to the world. He looks good, he sounds good, he speaks good English. There's nothing wrong with him in that sense. And again, I personally find him, a nice guy and interesting. I think he's done a good job as prime minister. He definitely, when you ask him straight up, is on the side of a two-state solution. He's supportive of expanding the Abraham Accords to include other Arab countries. He talks a good game. But whether he can actually pull it off and win this election remains to be seen. Again, you can never say never in Israel. And Benny Gantz is a good centrist candidate. He's been a good minister of defense. The security situation in Israel, even though we have seen an upsurge in terrorism in the last few months, and some Israelis. We've seen a good, the security situation has been a good reduction in terrorist attacks in the last few months. We have a huge opportunity.
It's okay, Steve. I can see you're working on it. We still can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. So yeah, the security situation has definitely stabilized, and there was a big operation in Nablus against terrorists. Four Palestinian terrorists were killed in what's called the Lion's Den group, and I think that Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz have done a good job of keeping the security situation in Israel fairly stable. But again, I'm not sure that when people go to vote this time, they're going to be voting for someone who they think has done a good job. Rather, they're going to vote for the person and the party that they think will be the best for Israel. And again, that is up to everyone and their individual conscience.
Daniel has his virtual hand up, and then we'll go to Marilyn.
Hey, Steve. So in like American elections, a lot of times like the unifying figure from the past is brought up, like a politician that's like revered by all, like Abraham Lincoln. In Israeli elections, who's usually like pointed out as like, okay, this person, would either support my policy or like, I'm like following in their legacy. Like, who's considered that figure?
So at the moment, the person who's presenting himself as that consensus figure is Benny Gantz, the defense minister, who is the head of a centrist, center-right party. And he certainly comes across as rational and as someone who's an alternative to Yair Lapid on the left and Benjamin Netanyahu on the right. And he's also a Benjamin, although he calls himself Benny, but he is definitely presented as that kind of Abraham Lincoln type, if you like, rational alternative to the left and right, someone who's centrist. And we'll see, maybe he will be the surprise of this election and get more votes than, garner more votes than people think. And he's allied himself with Gideon Sa'ar, who is a former Likudnik, a former interior minister, and together they've also brought other people like a former chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, into the party. And they have a very powerful alternative, but at the moment, they're not polling more than 11 or 12 seats. So we'll see. They could surprise, but they could be the key to forming the new next coalition. And it depends, again, how many seats Likud win on one side and Lapid and Yesh Atid win on the other, whether Gantz will be the kingmaker.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, Marilyn, you can unmute yourself. Nope, you're still muted.
Unmute.
There we
Okay,
go.
which of these parties is most supportive of the military, of your military?
No, I think, again, it's a good question, but I don't think I can answer that question. I mean, every party supports the military in Israel. You know, it's sort of, it's like supporting peace. Whether you do it or not, you wouldn't say you don't support peace. So every party is pro-military, every party is pro-peace. I think, you know, because Benny Gantz is a former military chief of staff and defense minister, obviously, and he's brought in another former chief of staff into his party. He does have strong security credentials, but you know, Netanyahu also is Mr. Security, and like I said, Lapid's done a good job over the past few months. So yeah, everyone supports the military in Israel. That's just a given, and I don't think you can say one party supports it more than the other. This latest deal, let me just throw in with Lebanon, did split the country though into left and right. Lapid and the left are behind this maritime agreement with Lebanon that's going to be signed tomorrow, whereas Netanyahu and the right are very much against it and see it as a capitulation to Hezbollah, and they certainly don't believe it should have been signed. So that agreement, which is a security agreement off the Mediterranean, which allows offshore drilling, both for Lebanon and Israel, has split the country. But again, we're a very polarized country, just like the United States, and people are very split between the left and the right. And hopefully this election will end that, but I wouldn't put my money on it.
Well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank you, Steve. You are so knowledgeable, and none of our questions stumped you. You had answers to everything. We appreciate you being with us live from Israel. There are a lot of bad things about COVID, but one of the good things about COVID was that our world got a little smaller as we learned to use Zoom. So I just want to thank you for being with us today. The program was recorded, so we will have a copy. I know we covered a lot of information today, and everyone can review the recording. And we will all be watching the Israeli elections very closely November 1st. We appreciate you getting us up to speed.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting me.
Thank you, Steve.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.